Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security will now come to order. I'd like to start off by welcoming Mr. Dan Bishop of North Carolina to the committee. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delighted to be with you.
Look forward to working with you, sir. Subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on 1 year later, the implementation of the TSA Modernization Act. And without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. I want to thank you, Ranking Member Lesko, and our distinguished witnesses for joining us today. 1 year ago this month, Congress enacted the first comprehensive reauthorization of the TSA known as the TSA Modernization Act. The act incorporated a substantial number of bills and provisions that originated in this committee. It stands as a testament to the committee's longstanding bipartisan efforts to conduct oversight of TSA. And I thank my colleagues, Ms. Watson-Coleman and Ms. Katko, and Mr. Katko, I should say, for their leadership in advancing legislation last Congress that I'm glad to carry on those efforts with the Ranking Member Lesko in this Congress. The TSA Modernization Act enhances and improves our nation's transportation security. The act is too comprehensive to describe in detail in a few minutes that we have, but I'd like to highlight a few key points. First, the act established a 5-year term for this TSA Administrator to provide stability to the agency's leadership. And sadly, the current chaos and leadership vacancies within DHF have undermined those efforts. Administrator Pushki has been forced to wear 2 hats, acting as both TSA Administrator and DHS Deputy Secretary. I commend the Administrator for answering the call to duty, but the role of TSA Administrator is a full-time job that requires full-time dedication to ensuring the security of our transportation system. I hope the President will nominate permanent leaders to fill many of the DHS vacancies and thus provide TSA with the stable leadership that Congress envisioned when it passed this legislation. In addition to establishing the Administrator's term, the TSA Modernization Act first pushes TSA to enhance its strategic planning efforts. Number 2, secures public areas of airport and service transportation systems, and it improves the security of air cargo transportation. And we appreciate TSA's dedication to implementing the many directives and reporting requirements in this legislation, as well as TSA's transparency in updating the committee on its progress. And although TSA has made significant progress on implementing the Act, I'm still concerned that TSA has not yet complied with the provisions that present some of the committee's biggest priorities in this Act. First, TSA is late in providing this committee a report on recommendations to reform its personnel management system. And as you know, this subcommittee recently highlighted issues facing the TSA workforce at its hearing in May. Transportation security officers serve on the front line securing our nation's transportation system, yet are among the lowest paid workers in the federal government. They're also not afforded some of the basic workplace protections that most other government employees enjoy. Improving working conditions for these officers is key to TSA's evolution as a professional national security agency, and I look forward to hearing more about the status of this important report. And I'm going to ask at this point unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the American Federation of Government Employees. Second, TSA is substantially late in providing a strategy that was due in February regarding plans to open the procurement process to a wider networks of technology companies, including participation of small businesses. TSA relies on the small number of vendors today to provide many of the screening technologies in use at airports nationwide. And as you know, small businesses in particular face difficulties in competing for TSA awards due to limited procurement cycles, high costs of certification, and lengthy testing and evaluation processes. I look forward to hearing what steps TSA is taking to ensure these processes are open and fair to all. And finally, TSA is overdue in providing an assessment of potential enhancements to surface transportation security. As you know, mass transit and other service transportation systems are particularly vulnerable to terrorist attacks, and it's important that TSA prioritize completion of these requirements. TSA must work to come into full compliance with the requirements of the TSA Modernization Act as soon as possible. And once again, I'd like to thank TSA and the GAO for being here today, and I look forward to a conversation. And with that, I'd like to turn this conversation over to the Ranking Member Lesko for an opening statement. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome as well Representative Dan Bishop from North Carolina. Welcome. This is a great committee. You're going to enjoy it. Very important. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here and the TSA officers and other employees that are here from TSA and DHS. Thanks for being here and participating. I am pleased that the subcommittee is meeting today to oversee implementation of last year's bipartisan reauthorization of the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA Modernization Act. Terrorists, of course, continue to target both surface and aviation transportation in ways that are constantly evolving. The TSA Modernization Act recognizes this reality and provides direction to the agency at a critical time. Importantly, this legislation marks the first ever reauthorization of TSA since the agency was created in 2001, following the terror attacks of September 11th. In so doing, Congress fulfilled its constitutional role to provide oversight, accountability, and direction to the federal government and the resources appropriated to protect the traveling public. The TSA Modernization Act took measurable steps to update many offices and programs within TSA and make the agency more prepared for current and evolving threats to transportation security. Some of these provisions included the establishment of a 5-year term for the TSA Administrator, authorizing the use of third-party explosive detection canines for passenger and cargo screening, providing additional resources and support to the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program, and outlining new enrollment objectives for TSA PreCheck. Now, a little more than 1 year after enactment, it is prudent for our subcommittee to echo the bicameral bipartisanship that facilitated the passage of this landmark legislation as we examine how effectively TSA has worked to implement the law. I commend Administrator Pekoski, who is currently serving doubly as the acting Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, for working closely with Congress on this legislation last year, and for his team's dedication to providing regular briefings to the relevant committees on implementation status. This work, along with congressional oversight, has resulted in 87% of the law's required actions for TSA being either successfully completed or on track for successful completion in a timely manner. For many of these provisions, GAO serves as the committee's watchdog on implementation in its review of TSA programs, offices, and security mitigation efforts. So I am pleased that they are represented here today as well. I look forward to hearing from TSA and GAO today on the status of outstanding provisions in the law, as well as what the agency has accomplished over the last year in fulfilling its statutory requirements. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. And I want to welcome the panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Ms. Patricia Cogswell, is the Acting Deputy Administrator for TSA. Prior to joining TSA, Ms. Cogswell held several leadership positions within the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and DHS, including as Acting Undersecretary for DHS intelligence and analysis. Our next witness, Mr. William Roswell, is a director at the Government Accountability Office, GAO's Homeland Security and Justice Team, where he is responsible for leading GAO's work on aviation and surface transportation security. Mr. Russell has over 17 years of experience at GAO and was previously an assistant director in GAO's Contracting and National Security Acquisitions Team. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. And now I ask each witnesses to summarize their statements for 5 minutes, beginning with Ms. Cogswell. Welcome, ma'am.
Good morning, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, and distinguished members of this committee. On behalf of TSA's employees, I want to express our appreciation for the continued support of Congress, the productive relationship we have with this subcommittee, and as well with the Government Accountability Office, as well as the authorities provided by the TSA Modernization Act of 2018. Implementing the TSA Modernization Act is a priority for TSA. I am grateful for the invitation to testify about our efforts to execute these authorities. Since its creation following the September 11th attacks, TSA's ongoing commitment to ensuring transportation security has enabled public and commerce to continue traveling securely and freely. 18 years later, the reality is that transportation systems remain highly valued targets for terrorists, and their methods of attack are more decentralized and opportunistic than ever. TSA must meet the challenge of a pervasive and constantly evolving threat environment in both the cyber and physical realms. In meeting this challenge, TSA's most important asset is its people. I am very proud of the 63,000 dedicated professionals who make up our workforce and every day demonstrate our core values of integrity, respect, and commitment. Together, the efforts of our workforce secures and facilitates transportation for an average of 85 million passengers, 2.56 billion in cargo, and critical transportation infrastructure around the country. Earlier this year, a significant portion of our workforce went without pay for 35 days during the partial government shutdown. Despite suffering financial and personal hardships, they demonstrated true professionalism and commitment to transportation security mission. We are grateful to Congress for continuing to explore ways to prevent this from happening again and stand ready to help you in achieving this goal. 2018 was a very important year for TSA and its direction. Not only did we release our strategy and administrator's intent, highlighting our strategic priorities of improving security and safeguarding the transportation system, accelerating action, and committing to our people, but the TSA Modernization Act became law, the first reauthorization of our agency. 2019 has been the year of implementation. We have conveyed through 8 progress meetings with this subcommittee staff that as of today, TSA has implemented more than 60% of the 180 requirements mandated by the Act and 72% of those with specific deadlines. Completed requirements include conducting a global aviation security review, creating an air cargo division, establishing a surface transportation security advisory committee, initiating a pilot program to test CT technology for air cargo, executing an automated exit lane technology pilot program in Phoenix Mesa Airport. Additionally, consistent with the TSA Modernization Act requirements to grow TSA PreCheck enrollment and limit the use of PreCheck lanes to those with known traveler numbers, we successfully conducted 2 pilots, both ensuring the feasibility and throughput for TSA use of PreCheck only lanes, as well as the future lane experience model, where non-PreCheck passengers designated as lower risk would receive alternative screening procedures. Continuing to evaluate risk and assessing technology, policy, and procedures in place to address that risk is critical to our mission execution. Recent examples of where we have done so consistent with the Modernization Act include updating the Federal Air Marshal concept of concept of operation through prioritized mission deployment strategy focused on high-risk travelers and revised international risk assessment models, as well as implementing changes to address insider risk, including establishing an Aviation Security Advisory Committee subcommittee on insider threat to assess ways to improve airport worker controls. Building on this critical work, TSA plans to produce a roadmap for mitigating insider risk in all modes of transportation. TSA also recognizes our strategic success depends on our workforce. TSA commissioned a blue ribbon panel of public and private sector human capital experts to review TSA's human capital policy and policy processes, and reestablished our National Advisory Council, which is comprised of advisors from our uniformed workforce. Through recommendations from these groups and others, TSA developed a number of workforce initiatives that we are now implementing, such as our two-tier performance system, our Model Officer Recognition Program, and our TSO Career Progression. Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify before you today. TSA is grateful for the authorities provided through the Modernization Act and is committed to implementing them as quickly as possible. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cogswell, and I'd like to recognize Mr. Bill Russell to summarize his statement in 5 minutes. Sir?
Good morning, Chairman Carrera, Ranking Member Lesko, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss TSA progress to implement the TSA Modernization Act. As you know, the Act included provisions intended to, among other things, improve aviation security, screening technologies, oversight of passenger screening processes, and surface transportation. The Act also included a number of provisions for GAO to review TSA's progress. This statement summarizes past work and observations from some of our ongoing work in assessing TSA's actions for selected areas. Overall, this body of GAO work shows that TSA has made progress consistent with provisions under the Act, but can improve in a number of areas. First, in terms of international aviation security, TSA took steps to strengthen assessments of foreign airport operators. For example, since our December 2017 report, TSA further enhanced its foreign airport assessments by capturing better data on vulnerabilities so they can be effectively mitigated. In addition, the Act included a provision for GAO to review security directives for airports in foreign countries that offer last point of departure flights to the U.S. TSA may revise or issue new security directives for domestic air carriers and emergency amendments for foreign air carriers when threat information or vulnerabilities at foreign airports indicate an immediate need for air carriers to implement additional security measures. In our review of this process, we found that TSA did not fully define how to coordinate with industry representatives prior to updating directives, which can lead to some difficulties in implementing needed changes. TSA had also not yet fully determined whether to cancel or incorporate many long-standing security directives into air carrier security programs in full accordance with TSA policy. We made several recommendations to address these issues, and TSA concurred with them. The Modernization Act also included provisions related to oversight of passenger screening rules. TSA developed screening rules by considering current intelligence and other factors to identify passengers who may require enhanced screening. In our forthcoming report, we found that oversight of this process has improved. TSA coordinates rule reviews through quarterly meetings and notifies an expanded set of DHS and TSA stakeholders of rule changes as called for under the Act. We also found that while TSA tracks some data related to rule implementation, it does not comprehensively measure rule effectiveness. We recommended that TSA explore additional data sources for better measuring the effectiveness of these rules. TSA is currently reviewing this recommendation. In terms of screening technologies, we reviewed the process used by TSA to deploy those technologies to airports, and in our forthcoming report, we found that TSA considers risks in its deployment decisions, but has not fully documented them. Importantly, we also found that after screening technologies have been deployed to airports, TSA does not fully ensure that these technologies continue to meet detection requirements, even though performance of that technology can degrade over time. We made several recommendations to address these issues, and TSA is currently reviewing them. Per the Act, we also reviewed TSA pipeline security efforts. We found that TSA's management of key aspects of its pipeline security can be improved, although coordination with pipeline operators is good. For example, TSA needs to better evaluate the number of staff and resources that it devotes to pipeline security, and to include a strategic workforce plan that can help it effectively identify the skills and competencies, such as cybersecurity expertise, necessary to carry out responsibilities. TSA concurred with those recommendations to address the issues and has efforts underway. In conclusion, TSA has taken important steps to improve security in response to the Modernization Act, but additional actions will be needed going forward, and we will continue to review TSA progress to implement these remaining portions of the Act. Chairman Carrera, Ranking Member Lesko, this concludes my prepared remarks, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Russell, thank you very much. You have a minute left. Thank you. And I thank all the witnesses for your testimony, and I'll remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our panelists. And now I'd like to recognize myself for the first set of questions. First one is for Ms. Cogswell. As you know, part of the TSA Act, Congress codified a 5-year term for the administrator of TSA. The current administrator, Mr. Pekoski, is wearing 2 hats. One is the administrator, and the other is acting secretary. And given these dual roles and duties, who's running the day-to-day operations at TSA?
Sir, thank you very much for your question. As part of his redesignation and position as the senior official performing the duties of the Deputy Secretary, he has authorized me to run most of the day-to-day operations for TSA. Through that process, I have a series of areas where I consult with him on a regular basis to ensure consistency with his direction and approach.
Thank you. How do you decide which issues are delegated to him versus you, and how has that affected the implementation of the Act?
With the way we have been approaching this process is through long-standing close collaboration. As you might expect, I talk to him multiple times a week. I look for any issues that I believe are of particularly sensitive or time-consuming nature to ensure that there is no instance where he would be caught off guard.
Given the concerns that we have, and I'm sure you're doing a great job, do we need a stable leadership at the top of the agency? Should these vacancies be filled?
It is incredibly important for TSA to have stable leadership over an extended period of time. I think it is one of the best parts of the Act was creating that goal and that mindset. I know the administrator shares that goal. I know he very much is a believer in this role and this position and would very much like to be able to see out the remainder of his term. At the same time, we recognize the importance of continuity across the Department of Homeland Security, and I can think of no one better qualified to be able to serve in this type of position than David Pekoski.
And as you know, Homeland Security is such a critical role defending our citizens, not only here but around the world. And so we want to be of as much help as possible, making sure you're able to implement your mission. Turning to another issue, which is workforce issues. As you know, the subcommittee has focused on the issues affecting the workforce. Section 1907 of the Act requires that TSA convene a workforce group with labor and submit to Congress a report containing recommendations to reform TSA's personnel management system. What is the status of that report?
Sir, the working group has formed and had many productive discussions, down to and including we extended the period of time because the discussions were so productive they had additional items they wanted to conclude. The working group concluded its deliberations at the end of August and completed the drafting of the report in September. The report is now in clearance.
When will you expect that?
I hope that it will be in a matter of weeks.
Matter of weeks. Thank you. The statute also says that the working group should consider reforms to the TSA personnel management system, including appeals to the Merit System Protection Board and grievances procedures. Were those topics considered by the working group?
Specifically, the group highly focused around discipline and grievances, yes.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, Madam Chair, I'm the chair. I'd like to turn over, I now yield, and I'd like to recognize Ranking Member, the subcommittee, the gentleperson from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you also had like a minute left, so we're really buzzing by here. This is great.
We're going to have a second round.
Oh, okay. I'm going to have a question for both of you. In the GAO's initial report from the TSA Modernization Act, the review found that TSA does not ensure that screening technologies continue to meet detection requirements after they have been deployed to airports. In this review, the GAO recommended that TSA implement a process to ensure technologies continue to meet detection requirements after deployment, and that TSA is currently reviewing this recommendation. So my first question is for Mr. Russell. Can you expand on this a little bit more? So we're putting in new technologies like, let's say, CT scanners, and we're not checking up on them to see if they're still working? Is that what you're saying?
Right, so what we found is for the fielded screening technology, so think about the body scanners, other pieces of equipment, there's an initial certification process when they complete the procurement process to ensure, run it through all its paces, it does meet all the requirements as expected, then it gets deployed to airports. So what we found is that on usually a daily basis, most airports have a calibration kit that they run through the equipment that checks various diagnostics for that equipment is working properly. But that check does not include ensuring that the actual detection of an explosive or other prohibitive items is operating at the same level as when it left, let's say, the factory in that certification testing. So that's what we're getting at.
And so, Mr. Russell, is that done, this detection, would it normally be done by people that are just trying to sneak things through? Is that what it would be? Or you're just saying after hours or whatever you would test it? How do you test it?
So that's where we have the recommendation that we think TSA should devise a process for how you periodically check that the equipment, once fielded, is in fact still operating at that high detection level when it left the certification process.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Cogswell, in relation to that, what can TSA do better? Do you have any ideas how you can do this? I went to that area where you were testing the different technologies and that type of thing. So how would you do a better job at this? How would you test somebody? Would you do like surprise checks with undercover people? What are you thinking?
Thank you, ma'am, and do very much appreciate your visit out to our Transportation Security Integration Facility, and would offer any of your colleagues, if they would like to come see it as well, we would be happy to have you out. This item is still under review. We are still putting together our official response. I think you've highlighted one of the most important pieces is ensuring that the plan that we come up with will meet GAO's interests while recognizing we already do testing today, as you highlighted. We already have processes by which we have covert testing against our systems to look for overall throughput, including a move to what we call index testing, where we do an assessment across our system to really understand what performance levels are at each time. This recommendation, I think, goes at a slightly different area, which is the efficacy of the technology over time. We've got a couple ideas around this, but we'll want to have a good discussion with GAO to make sure it matches their interests and thoughts. Because to your exact point, we can't actually really bring a live explosive to a checkpoint on a regular basis. Given all the equipment we have, how is the best way to approach this that meets the needs but is feasible and effective?
Thank you. And with the 51 seconds I have left, I have a question that really doesn't deal with this GAO report, but it's to do with the real ID. And, it's set to be in effect that everybody's supposed to have a real ID, a travel ID, by October 1st, 2020. And do we have any, thoughts? Does TSA have any thoughts? Because I'm worried that people aren't going to get these things in time. I mean, people are trickling and getting these, like I've gotten one and my son's gotten one, but the deadline hits. What are we expecting is going to happen? Because I think every single Congress member is going to be, tons of calls are going to happen because they're going to show up at the airport without this real ID and they can't fly.
So at this point, the most important thing we can do is get wider awareness of the deadline out to as many people as possible and help people understand that they have more than one option. So both you can get a Real ID compliant license, but if your state is not quite there, you also have other options to receive compliant documentation. Examples include passports, a global entry card, a military ID. So, but critical through all of this is to get the word out as far as possible, not only to the entire travel industry, who are working very hard with us, with local motor vehicle administrators to help create that awareness, to conduct local enrollment events at airports, at other locations, to try to ease that burden and make it more readily visible to people on how they can quickly update. But right now, most critical, we need to get the word out.
And I think all of us should help in doing that, because otherwise there's going to be a lot of people are going to call our offices, I think. So you had mentioned one of the alternatives is global entry already. Is PreCheck also an alternative?
At this time, it's important to recognize how PreCheck works today. Through PreCheck, we conduct a series of additional verifications looking for threat information within someone's background. However, when someone shows up at the travel document checker at the front of the queue, what they are often presenting is their driver's license. Under statute and implementing regulations, we are not allowed to accept a non-compliant driver's license after October 1, 2020.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko, and I'd like to recognize Mr. Cleaver for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cogwell, thank you for being here. Mr. Russell, thank you as well. None of this has anything to do with your work, but I've been in almost every other month, it seems, whenever we've had either a full hearing, committee hearing, we've had a new director or a new acting director, which can't possibly be one of the better things that's happening to the agency. That's not a question, it's a declaration. And so my concern is that not only are we having the changes at the top, but when we talk about the workforce issues, we still have an unbelievably high turnover rate of TSA employees. And that's, I hope that is as troubling to you as it is to me, because, I do an average of 1,800 air miles a week. And so, I get a chance to know the guys for about 6 months. And then there's a whole new group coming in, and it seems like every flight, every other time I come to the airport, they're training a new group to come in. My analysis is that it's due to the poor pay. Are we going to get that changed?
Thank you very much for the question, and I appreciate your efforts and interest in ensuring that you are caring for our workforce. I appreciate very much and know they appreciate your engagement at the checkpoint when you go through. It means a lot to them when people care about them enough to ask how their day is rather than just rushing along, so thank you so much for your support. As to pay, what we have authority to do now and already do is provide a retention incentive. So for those airports where retention is significantly above what we would like to see, we are authorized and do pay a differential to them now. That differential ranges from about 5% over the regular salary to up to 60% over the salary, depending on local working conditions and the level of retention we see at that specific location. We have additional authorities with respect to other pay reforms that we can take. Within the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, there is broad ability for us to set what type of pay system we have. What we don't have, however, is budget to make broad-scale changes across the board.
Okay, let's put a period right there for a minute. No, you can put a comma. But so let me interpret what I thought I heard you say, that significant changes can be made, but there is a need to increase the funding for positions before that can be done on a scale that would assure employees that there's a future in this.
We are very much working right now on a series of options that we are considering within the administration and look forward to working with Congress
Okay,
going
all right,
into
thank
the
you.
future.
You're very
state
kind.
budget.
I guess you can't. We need to pay them more money, and if I need to push for a higher budget, if there's an understanding that everything is being done now to increase the salaries with the budget that is there, then my belief is that we need to do budget increase, whatever we need to do, because I've never understood this. The people in whose hands we place our lives every week, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week, we pay them less money. I mean, it just doesn't register, with me. I can't figure it out. And so I want to fix it. Mr. Russell, can you help me? Somebody help me. Can you help me? What do you think? What needs to be done?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've seen in 2018, we did a report that looked at the staffing allocation model just to figure out how many airports or how many TSOs need to go to the airports. And what we found is that system's effective, but it's budget constrained. So they plug in the amount of funding that they have and then try to make the numbers work to best support the airports. So it could be a different number of TSOs that are needed if you unconstrain it when you do that model without the current budget, if that helps.
I think my time has run out before my questions have run out, but thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Cleaver, we'll have a second set of questions coming up. Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Bishop now for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Cogswell, TSA's explosives detection canine program is a critical element to screening passengers and baggage for a wide range of explosives threats. The TSA Modernization Act included several provisions aimed at improving that program. Section 1928 requires TSA to issue behavioral, medical, and technical standards for third-party explosives detection canines to screen passengers and property. What is the status of this provision, and can you provide any insight into what the committee can expect to see in terms of standards?
Thank you very much, and I share your appreciation for our canine detection teams. Every time I go out to airports or other locations and I see the canines in actions, while I love my job, I wish I loved my job half as much as those dogs love their job. Every day you see their incredible dedication and their hard work, and I love really seeing both the canines and their handlers in action. I will say, as to your specific question, we have formed the working group, and the working group has submitted their recommendations to TSA. We are now in the process of formalizing those into standards and should have those completed in the next month or 2.
The law also authorized a third-party canine cargo screening program. How has this provision been implemented, and what has the response been from transportation stakeholders?
We issued the implementing regulations last December and began immediately training the various teams. We have more than 230 teams that have been certified to date, including a number of third-party entities who are able to provide that certification. Overall, we have seen a tremendous interest out of the cargo environment and receive a lot of support from industry for implementing that provision.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bishop. I'd like to recognize Ms. Barragan now for 5 minutes of questions, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Cogswell, you mentioned in your opening remarks some progress done on surface transportation security. The Act, the TSA Modernization Act, pushes TSA to study innovative ways to advance surface transportation security. Under Section 1981 of the Act, the TSA is required to conduct the feasibility assessment of introducing advanced security technologies into surface transportation systems and increasing vetting and identifying verification of the surface transportation passengers. The assessment was due to Congress by April 3rd, 2019, but has not yet been produced. Can you tell us why that's the case and whether there has been an impact on the staffing that has impacted this deadline?
Thank you very much. As was noted also in my testimony, we stood up the Surface Transportation Security Advisory Committee. We have also done a significant outreach effort across the country to engage with the various stakeholders involved in this process to identify where some of their highest interests and needs are, to ensure that as we developed various ideas for that feasibility study and analysis, we were taking on those items of most interest.
So do we know when the study is going to be ready for Congress, the one that was due in April?
We still have some additional work underway within TSA to finalize up that analysis, and then it will need to go into review, so it'll be into early next year.
Early next year. Okay. In 2013, a gunman shot and killed a TSA officer at Los Angeles International Airport, my home airport. And in 2017, a gunman shot and killed 5 people at Fort Lauderdale International Airport. In the aftermath of these shootings, DHS and TSA called for airports to create unified operation centers to coordinate emergency response and improve communications. In Section 1987, the TSA Modernization Act required TSA to provide stakeholders a framework for establishing such centers. This language came from my bill, the Strengthening Local Transportation Security Capabilities Act. Ms. Cogwell, what is the status of this effort, and what resources has TSA provided to airports? Maybe you can shed some light on how many airports have created these unified operation centers.
We have issued those guidelines. We have currently are staffing full-time at 12 unified operations centers and have another 4 that are staffed intermittently depending on the various exercises or response activities underway at those locations. We are working across the board with airports to understand what model works best with them and what their expectations are for the other stakeholders within the airport community to promote a positive unified response.
Okay, what more can TSA and Congress do to push airports to establish the centers? Is there anything else that we can do to be helpful?
Continuing to talk about it. You're highlighting the need, the reason for people to not meet each other for the first time on a bad day, to regularly work problems together is the most important thing.
Okay. I want to take a moment to applaud the work of TSA and the work of the men and women who are on the front lines, I call it, at our airports. I am a firm believer that the greatest terror threat is going to come through airports and seaports. And the TSA officers and the work they do is so critical to the safety of Americans and the homeland. And so I want to applaud their work day on and day out. And my colleague touched upon the issue of pay and salaries. I frankly can't understand why we pay the men and women on the front line such a low amount of money when they are responsible for our security. And so I'm greatly concerned about what we can do to increase morale, increase retention, and making sure that they have representation to be in the strongest position possible. Now, the TSA Modernization Act directed your agency to create a working group to work with labor representatives and produce a report outlining recommendations on how TSA could perform its personnel management system. I'm aware that TSA is late in submitting this report to Congress, so I'm hoping you can provide clarity on it. When can we expect this report, and can you now list any recommendations provided by this working group?
The working group had a very productive discussion, agreed upon a number of joint recommendations. The report is in final administration clearance. We hope to have it cleared within the next few weeks.
Great, thank you, I yield back.
Ms. Watson-Coleman, you're recognized. Questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Cogswell, how are you today? Good. Ms. Berrigan just asked you about the working group. Did the working group consist of the union members as well? Was it the full, okay, and when was it constituted?
It started in the spring and went after the shutdown and went through, full meetings went through the end of August.
So the report that you're going to make is something that has, that you're going to report on. Is that consensus between the union and the agency with
Correct.
regard to these TSOs?
Yes.
Well, we're really excited to see that. The National Deployment Force, which is the short-term deployment force when there's a need, whether it's seasonal or an issue-related, is sent to ensure that there's adequate screening resources. The NDF was codified in Section 1988 of the TSA Modernization Act, actually based on my bill, the TSA National Deployment Force Act. The NDF was deployed last year to larger airports like Seattle and Denver, where TSA did not meet its hiring goals, and to airports in Hawaii, where TSA has a difficult time attracting candidates. What steps are you taking to hire permanent TSOs at those particular challenging airports?
Thank you very much for the authorization of the National Deployment Force. They have provided critical assets not only for the issues you have identified, but in response to a wide range of various needs across TSA, and this is a critically important aspect for us.
Right, I agree with you 100%. I just want to know what we're doing about trying to recruit people to work at those airports.
Absolutely. We have increased the retention incentive in those locations and authorized additional normal allocation hiring so that they could ensure consistency over time with the full complement of staff needed, as well as authorizing some additional measures, local travel, et cetera, so that there could be more load balancing in specific areas between hub and spoke airports in those areas.
So the work group that you, that was constituted in a report that's going to come out is also going to address these issues of these areas that you particularly like to live at, but you don't necessarily want to work there under the current conditions. Is that so? It'll affect how you work out these challenging airport hirings and retention.
So the work group specifically looked at discipline procedures as well as grievance procedures, focusing on those elements directly.
Did it not also look at hiring and retention?
It did not.
Was there an intention for it to look at the issue of retention in particular?
That was not an area where we signed them up for this round. We are having a number of other areas.
I'm asking though, does the bill, the law, include the discussion with the work group around those areas?
I do not remember at this time.
I'm not quite sure, but I think it does, because I think we were concerned about the recruitment and the retention and the discipline, you know, and any other sort of employee procedures. So I would appreciate feedback on that, if you don't mind. I want to ask you about something that has come to my attention with regarding to the federal Air Marshals. There was an article in September of this year that sort of spoke to what is considered a crisis and chaos in the federal Air Marshal area, and TSA's alleged inability to respond in such a way that keeps these Air Marshals from burning out. You've had a series of suicides. You had several allegations of, sorry, Siri, allegations of just sort of mental health issues. And a lot of it having to do with scheduling and the hours working and the deprivation of sleep and things of that nature. And I was just wondering, do you all have something that you're doing internally that's addressing these issues in particular that you could highlight for us now and perhaps we could discuss later?
Absolutely, and look forward to discussing it more in depth. So just as a highlight, I would note that that article did not bring forward new data. It was looking at prior information, so that The important piece to note is we already had a number of items underway. The first is where we are looking at what the right mix and balance is of flying versus on-ground time. That can mean your training time. It can mean what we call a ground-based assignment, where you rotate out of flying for some period of time and perform some other security function, for example, at the airport. It also looks at how we best provide services to our air marshals so that they have the help they need should they need it, and equip other members of the workforce to help engage with their colleagues.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman, it is an issue that I really would like for us to look at in a more in-depth way.
So noted, and we'll go in that
Thank you.
direction. Thank you.
I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to recognize a gentleperson from New York, Mr. Katko, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity, and welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. As part of the TSA Modernization Act, there was multiple insider threat provisions contained in it. So I just want to kind of get an update. I know we're past the deadline for that, and give you an opportunity to explain why we haven't received the information yet. But for each one of these, if you could just tell me where we're at in the process. Or actually, before we do that, tell me briefly why we haven't met the deadline that's included in the bill.
Thank you very much. The most important part through all of those insider threat elements is to ensure close, detailed cooperation and collaboration with the various stakeholders involved. As you well know, we don't actually implement these by ourselves in most instances. We are actually asking the airports to implement when we issue any kind of regulatory action. So what we want to do is ensure that the recommendations we identify as much as possible are done through a jointly collaborative process, and then our feasibility analysis, including the economic analysis that goes with it, is fully informed by what our stakeholders see and believe would be the impacts.
Now, the deadline, I believe, is October. And do you have a projected deadline when all these provisions will be accounted for and reported back to us?
So probably the largest piece, the feasibility study, we had to do a survey of more than 310 airports responded to that, which was wonderful input towards that analysis. That one is wrapping up in terms of its process and is about to go into interagency clearance. I hope, therefore, you would receive it early in the new year, if not before then.
Okay.
As to a number of other provisions, we have gone through an effort to receive direct input from the Aviation Security Advisory Committee and are working to put together an overall roadmap for insider threat for all modes.
Okay, I understand it, because it sort of didn't answer my question. When do you expect to have all this done?
So the actual report for all the recommendations, we look to have to you by early January.
Okay, I appreciate that. I am concerned that when there's a provision that we ask you to follow, that you didn't get it in a timely manner, but I do appreciate the diligence with which you're doing it. And if it goes past January, we might be a little bit more upset than we are right now. It's just be forewarned. Switching gears here, the PreCheck bill, which was passed into law. What's the status of the law's requirement to preserve the integrity of the TSA PreCheck lanes by only allowing enrolled passengers in PreCheck, while also establishing what the administrator said was the established modified screening lanes, or flex lanes that you call them, for other passengers determined to be low risk?
As you know, sir, we conducted pilots earlier this year for both models. Coming up on that, we determined both models are feasible. Both models have demonstrated throughput that we can manage. What we then needed to do was twofold. One, determine all of those locations, those airports, where based on current flow projected volumes, we can go ahead and implement well in advance, and which locations doing a pure PreCheck lane wouldn't allow us to manage the overall throughput for that airport. At this point in time, we believe that we are ready to start executing and have started executing, cutting over for all of those airports where we believe we can do so now. We believe in the end that's going to be about 75% of the total of 440 airports where we will be able to implement.
Okay, so now the current status of the PreCheck lane, is there non-PreCheck members still going through the PreCheck lane?
There is, but as I noted, we are starting to cut over now. You will start seeing airports that will.
When you say cut over, what do you mean?
We actually started this week.
When you say cut over, though, what do you mean by that?
So for those airports specifically, we will no longer have rules-based inclusion being used in that process.
Okay. When do you expect to be at 100% PreCheck only in PreCheck lanes? Because that's really what the bill's about, and that's what we're really interested in.
We are very mindful of the deadline and the interest to achieve that deadline. We very much also recognize the importance of providing a consistent experience. What we want to also not do, however, is totally disrupt an airport by doing so in a way that doesn't make sense. Critical to this is us being able to identify additional low-risk populations that would be eligible for some other kind of modified screening that is not as streamlined as PreCheck. That process is taking us a bit longer than I think any of us had hoped for, but it's critically important for us to get right. We will continue to provide you updates.
Okay, but I want to forewarn you all that that is not an optional date to be in compliance. So I don't want to have another hearing back here saying you didn't comply with that date either. It's very important from a security standpoint that only people that are in PreCheck, which is a higher level of repetitive screening of those candidates, should be in PreCheck. And also, people pay for it. And it's a service that they expect to have and enjoy. So that is not an optional deadline in that law. So I want to forewarn TSA that if that deadline is not met, there's going to be a lot of problems from this committee.
Understood.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Katko. I concur with you on that specific point. That should not be an option. I'd like to ask unanimous consent from this committee to have Ms. Jackson Lee join us here and to have Ms. Jackson Lee ask 5 minutes of questions. Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me acknowledge the chairman and the ranking member for their courtesy, and the members of the committee, and with a little bit of nostalgia, this is a committee I chaired some years ago, so I want to, first of all, express my appreciation to all of the TSOs that work across the nation, and to reiterate what I've done over and over again, that since 9/11, the American people would be absolutely shocked and amazed of the terrorist threats and danger to the aviation system that TSOs have prevented. I am concerned on several things, but let me first of all start with, every time we mention the employment landscape or the labor numbers, it looks like TSA says all is well, but you will find not even in the ordinary course of business where there are holidays or otherwise, that there are long lines and people are not in place or shifts are changing. What are you doing to modernize from the perspective of a free flow of a seamless system that has enough TSOs to be in place, whether or not they're at the AIT machine or elsewhere, to provide that extra level of comfort regarding the security mechanism that they're responsible for?
TSA has an extensive model where we receive information from the aviation community about projected volumes, number of tickets sold, when new flights will be on board, so that we can model not only airport by airport, but down to checkpoint by checkpoint based on projected volumes. You have highlighted correctly, there are instances where those models don't quite work. Number one, of course, is anytime there's a thunderstorm set that comes up the East Coast. But in a series of other instances, we look for how best to meet the need. I will say the most important part from our perspective is ensuring that we are working to retain our throughput timelines within our established parameters, which is 30 minutes for standard and 10 minutes for PreCheck.
Does that mean, let me try to pierce that, does that mean, do you have every TSO that you need to make the system work across the United States of America at this time?
There are a number of instances, and we are working closely with those airports, where airline volume continues to increase at a very hefty rate, which is fantastic for our economy of this country. Unfortunately, a number of these airports were not actually built to accommodate that level of throughput within the existing lane structure. In those instances, we work very closely with the airports to understand how best can we open up a new lane, move shops or other to make additional space. We then staff those lanes as they become available. We also talk with them about what their longer-term plans are for redevelopment of their terminals to service those additional volumes.
I want to make the same point and follow up about the deadline regarding the certified identification. And I would hope that we could get an update as we move toward the deadline. I just fear a great deal of confusion and also persons' inability to have that ID. I would encourage, and let me just ask a question because I have another question. Are you all doing a sort of last-minute massive education outreach level that you can actually hear it and pierce it? That means it has to be on all levels of social media, including the old-fashioned television. I've seen and heard nothing, absolutely nothing. So.
Yes, we are working extremely closely across the board with the travel industry, talking to them about how they can change up some of the communications they have as passengers are actually buying tickets. We are actually, as people are flying now, our officers are advising someone, the document you are providing
You will
today.
do because my time is,
Yeah.
you will do an outreach campaign
are
yourself.
doing outreach.
You're budgeted to do that.
TSA is doing a full outreach around the traveling public. DHS is
Before
doing
the
a
deadline.
larger. We have started already.
All right, let me ask you about the travel program. I want to raise the name of Crystal Saunier. She's with the New Black Panther Party, and I have spent the time dealing with the crisis of treatment by the TSA when she travels over and over again. From my perspective, in her background, she poses no threat. What is her route of getting off of, I assume it shows up on her ticket. I use her as an example. She's allowing me to use her name. What is the process for someone, like when I first came here, Ted Kennedy was on the list, John Lewis was on the list. How do you extract yourself from being off this list? And I would also say that as they do their job, I think it is very important to do their job. Let me be very clear. But can you have them particularly sensitive to the approach, to the language, to how you move the person around? Obviously, they're not a threat right there because you already see that they don't have any weapons. They're already in the security area. But what is their process?
Yes, ma'am. There's a couple pieces I would highlight out of this. The first and foremost is the ability to go through what's called DHS TRIP. So anyone who has had an issue while traveling may apply through DHS TRIP. This is a program that is government-wide, but we manage it out of TSA. The number one thing we find is the vast majority of individuals who are actually applying aren't actually on a watch list, but might have a sounds-alike name, similar spelling, similar name, similar date of birth, and therefore are inadvertently matched against a record. Quite easy for those individuals. We are able to distinguish them after they provide us additional information. We then give them a redress number. When they use that redress number in their travel as they are making it with the airline, we therefore know not that person, and therefore they will not match.
I will pursue that with you further and try to directly make sure that we can find a way. I think it should be publicly made, Mr. Chairman. This is something that happened in the early stages of TSA when an 8-year-old boy, we spent like 2 years trying to get him off the watch list. Late Senator Ted Kennedy, as I said, John Lewis, and a number of others were on this list and were either rejected for tickets or couldn't get through. So we haven't heard as much, but we still have some of them, as you well know. And I think for the traveling public, certainly TSA and TSOs are doing their job. But I really want to make sure that there's a pathway for those who are going through security and are not threats and are treated as such. But I thank you for yielding, and I look forward to working with you and monitoring the modernization program. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lena. I think she's absolutely right. That's a very important issue. Were you, Mr. Cleaver, on that list as well? Wrong
I
sermon.
left out my pastor here. Thank you. Yes, you were. Don't want to speak out of turn, but I think he knows how it feels. And I assume because he has a very important and unique name. I yield.
Thank you. With that being said, I'd like to start a second round of questions, if I may, and I'll start out with recognizing myself for another 5 minutes of questions, and want to follow up to Mr. Cleaver's comments about TSA personnel pay. You still have a lot of part-time folks working, correct? And if I was to extrapolate from my discussions with some of your workers, you do have a high turnover. I think if you have a part-time job, most of the folks working for you are there part-time until they can get another full-time job somewhere. So I think that's the crux of the issue. So this a budgetary challenge that we have?
We actually, as part of the 2020 budget, changed up the ratio for our part-time and are decreasing the number of part-time individuals authorized across our airports. There are specific locations where it still makes a lot of sense. You have individuals who have retired from other jobs and don't actually want to work a full schedule. Works very well for them, and especially in some of those locations, depending on the type of workforce.
So would you say a lot of those part-timers would prefer to be part-time than full-time?
Those part-timers, those specific ones I highlighted, would prefer to stay part-time. There are others, however, who would very much like to and would prefer full-time.
Imagine there's a lot of folks that are not retired who would probably want some stability from a full-time job and probably don't have that opportunity. So I guess my next question is, in terms of budget, we have that tax, that fee we pay on tickets, that's supposed to go to airport security?
Yes.
And it goes to airport security?
All but the amount set aside under the Budget Control Act to go to deficit reduction.
Say that again? I love the way you put that. Can you restate that? It doesn't go to airport security. It does not.
That amount does not. That amount goes to deficit reduction. The remainder comes to TSA.
So we tax our passengers for security, and that money does not go to security, it goes to debt budget reduction. Thank you. Let's move on to small business participation. This committee is also focused on increasing small business participation, especially in the area of new screening technologies. The Act requires TSA to produce a strategy back in February to outline how you're supposed to get there. What's the status of this strategy, and why are we 8 months late on this specific area?
The strategy is within administration interagency clearance. We hope to have it out within the next few weeks. I will say this is an area that I do actually feel quite proud and might take a few minutes talking about some of the areas.
Please do. I
where
do
we
want to follow up on this one specifically.
Thank you. Seek to incentivize and build out. We agree with you that it is critically important to continue to look for new entrants in this space, that we not solely see just a consolidation of the market, but that we also look for the best ideas, even for, and frankly, more importantly, from individuals who've maybe never even thought of themselves as working in the security community. Just as a couple examples I'd like to highlight. Last year, we ran a special exercise through DHS Science and Technology with a number of entities out in the wider world, including educational institutions, to look at new algorithms for our AIT machines, the on-body screening detection systems. Incredibly promising work, all from individuals who had not previously provided this kind of service to TSA before. We have those algorithms in the lab now. Depending on the results, we would look to deploy them out on our existing fleet, increasing both our detection and reducing our false positives that we see in that arena. Other examples of the $2.1 billion that TSA spent last year in acquisitions, $450 million was actually to small business, exceeding our target for last year, almost a quarter of our entire work.
CT machines, do you see small businesses engaging in this area?
Yes, one of the vendors who is directly involved and is currently undergoing trials is in fact a small business.
What percentage of your non-service contracts are set aside for small businesses?
So at this time, we do not have a set aside, but we have indicated in the current CT procurement that we may choose to have a set aside.
Do you have a set aside for veterans?
I don't know the answer. I can follow up with you.
Please.
If I might highlight one other area, if it's acceptable?
Please do.
So in this past year, just as an example, we do a broad agency announcement that also seeks different angles, different work against key problem areas through our innovation task force. Last year, we received 85 submissions from 104 different vendors, 55 of which had never responded to a TSA solicitation, 72% had never contracted with TSA. Of the ones awarded, we selected 12 for demonstration, 7 are small business.
And I want to encourage you to continue to look for small businesses. That's where the innovation is going to come from. I'm sure your traditional standard contractors are doing a fine job, but if you want to think out of the box, come up with some ideas, you've got to go somewhere where you haven't gone before. So please continue to do that work. I'm out of time, so I'd like to recognize Ms. Lesko for 5 minutes of questions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for Ms. Cogswell. Section 1906 of the law requires TSA to complete a comprehensive agency-wide review to produce spending reductions and administrative savings that can be achieved by streamlining offices within TSA. This provision also asks TSA to eliminate duplicative programs and reduce the number of senior executive service personnel by as much as 20%. And I would assume one of my questions is going to be if we can reduce these duplicative, if I'm saying it right, programs and reduce the number of senior executive personnel, could we then move the money over to the concern about TSO officers pay? And anyway, this report was due on August 1st. I guess we don't have the report yet, so my question is twofold. When do you think we're going to have the report, and can we utilize any of these savings and move it over to TSO pay increases?
Thank you very much, ma'am. We have completed the analysis, including already implementing significant realignments across the agency. We also have projected in some additional cost savings for headquarters associated with our move going into next year out to Springfield of about 11% across headquarters functions, with the sole intent of reallocating those resources to the field. The report itself is within interagency clearance, and we hope to get it to you within the coming weeks.
Wonderful, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko, and I'd like to recognize Mr. Cleaver for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I was having difficulties getting through the airport, which was because of my last name, but for an American airline government relations person here in Washington, I'm not sure that I would not still be on there. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about money. This is not your fault, as I said before, but I think you're about the fourth person this year that I've raised this issue because of my concern. And so, how long are you going to be here? How long are you going to be here in the job?
I'm not intending to leave anytime soon. I was selected at this job. I've been here about 18 months.
Okay, see, the problem is that, I talk to one person and they say, okay, you're right, we got to do something. And then the next month we have a new director, a new acting director. And so I don't want to waste your time, my time, talking about something that, you won't be around long enough to address. Tell me, what is the starting salary for a TSO?
If you look at the base salary without the locality pay included, it's about $27,000, roughly equivalent to a GS4 in the general schedule. If you add in locality pay, most locations is about $33,000.
The GS4 is probably not going to get shot at.
I'm sorry, sir?
A GS4 is probably not going to get shot at.
The GS4 position that it is modeled after is the position that is designated by OPM for what is called unarmed security guard, is the comparator. I share with you, however, the very strong interest in recognizing the incredible professionalism of our workforce, the increasing automation that they are required to know, the sheer variability in their environment, and completely concur with you that I value them well above that.
Okay, so we got to get this fixed. I know, let me just, maybe I'll have to do something when we hopefully we're going to get a budget or some kind of spending bill, because there are a couple of things that I want to try to get in there. One is that we got to stop, paying these people who are putting their lives on the line a pittance. And the other part is my airport, and you're the fourth person that I've talked about, the Kansas City International Airport, Kansas City, Missouri, is one of only two airports in the country where we don't have government TSA workers. I can't work, there's nobody around long enough to work with because I want to get that stopped and changed. San Francisco is the other airport, but I don't want ours to stay like it is. So there are two things that I need your help on. One is the money, and one is this private contractor who is running the TSA airport in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm not mad at him or her, but it started out, just like we were the facial recognition. It started out as some kind of a pilot project rather, and the pilot been rolling now since 9/11. And I needed to be changed. So can you change it by the time I come back next week?
The Screening Partnership Program is established in law, sets out the exact parameters for how we put out the parameters, the requirements for how the program operates, how we identify which vendors will be able to meet the...
Well, there are only two. I mean, everybody else on the federal program, so I don't...
We have 24.
Little bitty airports. You're talking about little tiny, I've been to those airports too. Wichita Falls, Texas, where I graduated from high school. You're right. But I'm talking about the largest city in the state of Missouri, the largest city in the lower Midwest. And we still running on a program that's supposed to be temporary.
We're happy to come and talk with you more. We work very closely with airports involved. They are the ones who determine whether or not they want to pursue.
The airport.
The airport authority is the actual one who says they want to pursue the private entity.
Okay, we don't have an airport authority. I used to be the mayor of the city. We don't have an airport authority.
We'll be kind of happy to come and talk with you more specifically about your airport.
I'll be happier. I'll try to work with you after.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cleaver. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Jackson Lee for 5 minutes of questions.
Can I again say how grateful I am for your kindness and to the committee? Let me say to Congressman Cleaver, please count me as joining in enthusiastically. When this program began, I was in opposition to it, again, not in any negative reflection on contractors, but I think because the TSOs are frontline security for national security, there should be a consistent managing structure. And as indicated, Congressman, the airports opted in. They were given this, but it was put into law by us. Individuals who I think thought privatization was a good thing, and many of us opposed it, but it is in law, so that means the airport can opt in, but they can opt out, except for a sort of a lease situation, not a lease, but a contract, whether it runs out or not. But that's what happened. I think the other thing that I want to make sure is that we're no longer thinking about not having TSOs at small airports. Remember, that was proposed in some, I think, mindless concept that we won't put them at the small airports. We'll wait till someone gets on the plane as a terrorist and go to the big airport. So I just want to get that answer. That is no longer on the table regarding small airports not having TSOs under the Transportation Security Administration.
Correct.
Okay. The other thing is I want to join and make the point about the salaries of TSOs, because one of the modernization is the questions that GAO mentioned, and I'd like him to expand, is the modernization of technology. I want to know, are we moving fast enough? Is TSA moving fast enough with the new type of technology to detect more sophisticated ways of terrorist behavior? Sir.
Certainly. So we've seen with the computed tomography at the checkpoint, that's the latest technology that's being piloted. But certainly we have thinking adversaries, they're changing tactics, new threats. When we last looked at TSA's covert testing program, we saw that there were some challenges there and what their own red teams were able to find when they did their covert tests. And so I think the key there for TSA is really, once you know the vulnerabilities, whether it's technology or processes or things that your TSOs might be doing or could be doing better, to find a mitigation solution and effectively get those implemented. And so we had a few recommendations that TSA is working on in that regard.
Can I yield to the deputy to see, are you moving on the recommendations of GAO, particularly with technology?
We are moving on those recommendations. We have a significant program. I highlighted our Innovation Task Force as one of these key areas where we are able to rapidly bring on board potential solutions that have gone through kind of an initial review with that ability to do demonstrations, determine the effectiveness well before it's ready for full market. This lets us expedite our development of our requirements process, frankly, as well as help understand whether or not there's feasibility in a specific location. Significant improvement over traditional procurement processes.
So does that mean holistically that you're trying to make amends or correct the slowness in technology, or to expand technology and then train TSOs on that new technology? Is that a goal that you're working on?
Absolutely to all three of those, yes.
And then I would add, and I compliment the gentleman from Kansas, from Missouri, Kansas City, on raising the contracting issue. My concern would be in these airports that accepted that, I want to make sure the salaries are comparable and that you are taking under advisement the need for increased salaries. What do you need from us? I know money, but what is the structure that you need to increase the salaries of your TSOs?
So just to highlight the point you made about the difference between the TSOs and the SPP airports, we do require that they pay the same amount that we do. So if we are able to identify additional funds to increase salaries, they would be required to match as well. What we would like in the near term is the ability to have some robust conversations with you about different models. What's within our authority, what's the options within the funding caps that we receive for the coming years to determine the best path forward. And I can't say enough how extremely valuable we think it is that you are asking these questions and expressing this interest. Incredibly valuable for the workforce of our morale, as well as demonstrating the interest and importance that these officers perform on a day-to-day basis.
I could squeeze one more question, and we opened a couple of years back the academy in Georgia. I want to know how that's working and this whole idea of professional development. Are you all still encouraging? I understand you send TSOs to that school after they've been on staff for a while. You've changed the format. Is that working? Is that accurate, what I'm saying? And can you tell me how that's working?
Absolutely. Yes, we changed our model. What we had found when we stood up our centralized capability was we were bringing people on board, immediately sending them to a multi-week training, and then in rapid order, they were really understanding what life was like working at a checkpoint and deciding perhaps it wasn't the best fit. Through our new model, we are able to train them on certain functions that don't require that full training, let them experience the environment, see how loud it is, see what it's like interacting with several thousand people a day, make sure it's a good fit for them, then go through the training. We are seeing a decrease in the number of people leaving after the training, saving us the expense of that as well.
So professional development is very important.
Critically important and part of our TSO career progression as well.
We need to keep funding it.
Absolutely.
All
Thank you
right,
very
I yield
much
back,
for that.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the witnesses for your very, very valuable, important testimony, and I want to thank the members also for their questions. And if I can, Ms. Cogswell, you heard some of the messages here today were very important to us to try to reduce turnover, implementation of technology, PreCheck, and of course, the issue Mr. Cleaver brought up, which is how do you get off those lists once you're on them. Members of the committee have any additional questions for the witnesses? We ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions, and without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days, and seeing no further business, this subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you very much.